The ward was always quietest at 3 in the morning. That was something Eleanor Marsh had learned in her very first week as a young nurse at St. Catherine's Medical Center, 27 years ago, when the hallways still smelled of old linoleum and industrial bleach and the night shift felt like a secret world that existed parallel to the one everyone else lived in. The daytime world was noise and urgency and family members crowding doorways with their questions and their fears. But the night belonged to the nurses and the patients and whatever passed between them in the dark. And Eleanor had loved it. She had loved it the way some people love rain, not in spite of its heaviness, but because of it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She was 49 years old now, and her feet knew every creak in the floor of the cardiac care unit at Maplewood Regional Hospital in Millbrook, Ohio. Her dark hair had gone silver at the temples years ago, and she had stopped trying to cover it somewhere around her 42nd birthday, the year her mother died, and she decided that certain kinds of pretending were simply no longer worth the effort. She wore the silver the way she wore everything, quietly, without apology. She was not the kind of woman people wrote stories about. She knew that. She was the kind of woman who showed up, who remembered that Mr. DeLuca in room 412 took his blood pressure medication better if you handed him a small glass of orange juice alongside it. Not because the medical chart told her to, but because she had noticed. Who always knocked twice before entering a room, even when the patient was unconscious, because she believed the body could hear even when the mind could not. Who had driven 40 minutes out of her way on a Tuesday evening to drop off a bag of groceries on the porch of a patient's wife who had mentioned, almost in passing, that she had not been able to get to the store since her husband was admitted. That was Eleanor. Not a headline, just a woman who showed up, every single shift, and meant it. The night that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday in February. The kind of cold that does not announce itself but simply settles into the bones and stays there. Eleanor was 49 minutes into her overnight shift when the ambulance bay doors opened and they brought in a man named Arthur Whitfield. She did not know his name yet when they wheeled him past her station. She knew only what the paramedics were saying in their fast, clipped shorthand: cardiac event, male, approximately 70, found unresponsive in the parking garage of the Millbrook Public Library. No ID on his person, no phone, no wallet, nothing in his pockets except a folded receipt from a drugstore 3 blocks away and a small photograph, worn at the edges, of a young woman laughing at something the camera could not see. He was unconscious. His color was the particular gray that Eleanor had learned to recognize over 2.5 decades of overnight shifts. The color that meant the body was fighting very hard and was not certain it would win. His hands, she noticed, were large and slightly rough at the knuckles, the hands of a man who had worked with them at some point in his life, whatever else he had become afterward. Someone had dressed him carefully that morning. His coat was good quality, his collar pressed, but he had been alone in a parking garage and no one had come for him. The ER team took over. Eleanor returned to her station. She had 4 other patients that night, all of them requiring her attention, and she moved through the next 2 hours with the focused efficiency that had made her one of the most trusted nurses on the cardiac floor for the better part of a decade. It was close to 2 in the morning when the attending, Dr. Reeves, found her at the medication station. "The John Doe from the ER," he said quietly. "We are moving him up to you. He's stabilized, but it is not clean. We do not know who he is. Nobody has called for him. His heart is fragile right now and he keeps trying to come partially awake and then going back under. He is going to need someone close tonight." Eleanor nodded. "Send him up." She settled Arthur Whitfield, which she would not know to call him until much later, into room 408, at the end of the hall where it was slightly quieter. She checked his vitals, adjusted his line, noted the particular rhythm on his monitor that she did not love but could work with. Then she pulled the small chair from the corner of the room and placed it beside his bed, because she had learned long ago that proximity mattered in ways the textbooks never quite managed to capture. He surfaced a little past 3. Not fully, nothing like consciousness, but enough that his hand moved against the sheet and his brows pulled together in the way people's did when the body was frightened and the mind could not quite explain why. Eleanor reached over and placed her hand over his. "You are safe," she said, the way she always did, not loudly, just clearly, as if she were stating a fact. "You are at Maplewood Regional Hospital." You had a cardiac episode, but you are being taken care of. You do not need to worry right now. Just rest. His hand stilled beneath hers. His breathing evened slightly. She stayed. She should have gone back to her station. She had other patients, paperwork, the thousand small demands of an overnight shift on a busy cardiac ward. But something about the way his hand had moved, something about that photograph of the laughing young woman that the ER nurse had placed in the small bag with his belongings, something kept her in that chair. She talked to him the way she sometimes talked to patients who could not respond. She told him about the weather outside, how it had been the kind of cold that made the parking lot lights look like they were shivering. She told him that the hospital kitchen made a surprisingly decent apple pie on Tuesdays, and that she had been meaning to take a slice home for 3 Tuesdays in a row and had not managed it yet. She told him that the nurses on the day shift were good people and would take good care of him when she left in the morning, that he was not going to be alone. She held his hand for 4 hours and 17 minutes that night. She knew because she checked the clock when she finally stood up to go check on the patient in room 411, and she was briefly startled by how much time had passed. It had not felt like time passing. It had felt like the particular kind of presence that settles over you when you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Arthur Whitfield, as she came to know him in the days that followed, regained full consciousness on Thursday morning. A family friend had finally contacted the hospital, alarmed by his absence, and his identity was confirmed. By the time Eleanor arrived for her Thursday overnight shift, he was sitting up slightly, his color improved, his eyes clear and dark and very awake. She had not expected him to remember her. Patients in that state rarely did. The partial consciousness of a frightened body in the middle of the night was a different country from the clear daylight world of recovery, and she had long ago made her peace with the fact that most of the moments that mattered most to her were invisible to the people she shared them with. But when she appeared in his doorway Thursday evening to check on him before the shift settled into its rhythm, Arthur Whitfield looked at her for a long moment and then said, in a voice still roughened by oxygen tubes, "You stayed. You talked to me. I heard your voice." Eleanor paused in the doorway. She had learned over many years to receive this kind of statement without making too much of it, because patients sometimes experienced all sorts of things, and it was not always useful to encourage them to build meaning where there might be only the fragmentary impressions of a stressed and struggling mind. "You were having a difficult night," she said simply. "I sat with you for a while." He looked at her with an expression she found difficult to categorize. It was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. It was something more searching than that, the look of a man reassessing something he thought he understood. "You held my hand," he said, "for a long time." Eleanor set down the chart she was carrying. "Yes," she said, "I did." Arthur Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My daughter's name is Caroline. She is 23 years old, and she is the finest person I know. I need you to understand that I am telling you something that matters when I tell you about her." Eleanor came fully into the room and sat down in the chair she had been sitting in 2 nights ago, because something in his voice told her that this required a chair. "I have not been," he said, choosing his words with the care of a man who took honesty seriously, "a good father in the practical sense. I have been busy. I built something that required an enormous amount of me, and I gave it the enormous amount it required, and Caroline grew up in houses that were very large and very empty a great deal of the time. Her mother died when she was 4 years old, and I was not," he stopped. "I was not adequate to what that required from me. I was adequate to the company, not to her." Eleanor said nothing. She had learned that there were moments when the most useful thing a person could do was simply not fill the silence. "I have been trying to correct that," he said. "For the past 3 years, I have been trying to rebuild something that I let go to ruin while I was occupied elsewhere." He looked at the window, where the February dark pressed against the glass. "She has been patient with me, more patient than I deserve, and I was on my way to see her tomorrow. She lives in Columbus. We had plans for dinner." He paused. "I suppose the plans will need adjusting." Eleanor stayed in the room for another 20 minutes that evening. She came back twice more during the night to check on him. Both times he was awake, both times they talked, not the long sustained talking of that first night, but the ordinary back and forth of two people getting to know each other in the particular way that hospitals create, stripped of pretense by circumstance, honest in ways that ordinary life rarely allowed. She learned that he had grown up in a small town in western Pennsylvania, the son of a man who had worked in the steel industry all his life and had wanted something different for his son. She learned that he had built a company, though he was vague about the specifics, and that the building of it had consumed decades. She learned that he had a habit of walking to the public library when he needed to think, which was what he had been doing the evening his heart had made its catastrophic objection to the pace he had been keeping. He learned that Eleanor had grown up 3 towns over from Millbrook, that she had known she wanted to be a nurse since she was 7 years old and had sat with her grandmother in the hospital and watched the nurses move through the room with a kind of calm authority that seemed to her the most important thing a person could be. He learned that she had never married, not because she had not wanted to, but because the timing had never arranged itself correctly, and by the time she had stopped waiting for the timing to arrange itself, she had built a life that was full in the ways that mattered to her. He learned that she had a vegetable garden she was very proud of and a cat named Barnabas who was not particularly affectionate but had excellent judgment about weather. On Friday morning, his daughter Caroline arrived. Eleanor saw her from the nurse's station, a young woman in her mid-20s with her father's dark eyes and a composure that had clearly been assembled in a hurry, the way composure is assembled when you receive a phone call that stops your heart for a moment before your training in being your father's daughter kicks back in. She was carrying a canvas bag and wearing a coat that was slightly too light for the February weather, which meant she had grabbed whatever was closest and gotten in her car. She went into her father's room and the door closed, and Eleanor did not need to know what happened behind it, because that was not her business. But she saw Caroline emerge 40 minutes later, red-eyed but steady, and heard her asking the nursing station about her father's care plan, asking specific and intelligent questions in the voice of someone who had once been a child who learned to compensate for absence by learning everything about everything, so that she would always know what to do when something went wrong. Eleanor answered her questions directly and thoroughly, the way she answered every family member's questions, which was to say without condescension and without false comfort. Your father is stable. The next 72 hours are important. He needs rest, and he needs to understand that the pace he has been keeping is not something his heart will continue to accommodate. She paused. He knows this. He told me himself that he has been making changes. That is actually a meaningful thing, when patients understand it themselves before you have to tell them. It suggests they will actually follow through. Caroline looked at her for a moment. He mentioned you, she said. He said you sat with him the first night. Yes. He said he heard your voice, that it helped him, that he knew he was not alone because of it. Eleanor received this simply. I hope so. Caroline was quiet for a moment. She had her father's way of choosing words carefully, Eleanor noticed. It seemed to be a family trait. Thank you, she said finally. I mean that in the way that is hard to say without it sounding smaller than it is. I know nurses do this all the time. I know it is your job. But it was my father, and he was alone, and you stayed. So thank you. It was Thursday before Arthur Whitfield was discharged. Eleanor was not on shift that morning, but she had come in slightly early because she had a handoff conversation with the day nurse and because, if she was being honest with herself, she wanted to see him leave under his own power, which felt important. He was sitting in the wheelchair that hospital policy required for discharge, wearing the coat he had arrived in, looking substantially better than the gray-faced, unconscious figure the paramedics had wheeled past her station a week ago. Caroline was beside him, their shoulders nearly touching, talking to him in a low voice that Eleanor could not hear from the hallway. Arthur Whitfield looked up and saw her. He did not wave or make a production of it. He simply looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize over the course of that week, that searching, reassessing look of a man who had encountered something he had not expected and was not certain yet what to do with it. Then he nodded once, the nod of a person communicating something that does not have a word. Eleanor nodded back. Then she went to start her shift. She thought about him sometimes in the months that followed. She thought about his hands and the photograph of Caroline laughing, and the way he had said his daughter was the finest person he knew, with the particular emphasis of a man making a declaration he had come to late and wanted recorded somewhere. She thought about Caroline and her too light coat and her careful questions and the word thank you delivered in the way that is hard to say without it sounding smaller than it is. She did not expect anything from that week. She had not given anything in expectation of return. She had sat with a frightened man in the dark because that was what the moment required, and she was the person in the room, and that was simply who Eleanor Marsh was. She did not think about it as kindness, particularly. She thought about it as showing up. 3 months later, in May, a patient on her ward mentioned almost in passing that he had read something in a financial publication about a company called Whitfield Development Group completing a major acquisition. Eleanor did not connect the name immediately. When she thought about it later that evening, going over the day in the quiet way she processed things, she felt a small, startled recognition, followed by a kind of amusement at herself for not having made the connection sooner. She had sat with a man for 4 hours holding his hand and told him about apple pie and had not thought to inquire what his company actually did. This, she decided, was probably to her credit. She did not reach out. There was nothing to reach out about. She had done what she did, and he had recovered, and the world had continued. That was the complete transaction as far as she understood it, and she was at peace with that in the deep, settled way she was at peace with most things. Life moved in the way it did. Summer arrived and her garden produced an extraordinary quantity of tomatoes, which she distributed among her neighbors with the focused generosity of someone who takes the abundance of a vegetable garden as a serious responsibility. Barnabas developed a grudging tolerance for the new cat next door. The cardiac ward at Maplewood Regional hired 2 new nurses who were excellent and whom Eleanor took under her guidance the way she had been taken under the guidance of the nurses who came before her, firmly and with high expectations and with the understanding that the work they were doing was the most important kind there was. She turned 50 in November and had a small dinner with the colleagues who had become her closest friends over 25 years of overnight shifts and difficult days. Her friend Joan, who had been a nurse on the same floor for 19 years, gave a toast that made Eleanor laugh and then, unexpectedly, cry and then laugh again. Joan said, "Eleanor Marsh has been showing up for this ward, for these patients, and for every one of us for 25 years, and every single one of them got more than they paid for, and we are all the better for it." What Eleanor did not know, sitting at that dinner table surrounded by the people who knew her best, was that 25 years of showing up had been seen and was about to be remembered. She did not know that in a house in Columbus, Ohio, a young woman named Caroline Whitfield kept a framed photograph on her desk, the one from her father's belongings bag, the one of Caroline herself at 21, laughing at something the camera could not see, laughing because her father had made a joke, genuinely made a joke, for the first time in years, and she had been so surprised she had laughed until her eyes watered. She did not know that Caroline kept that photograph because her father had been carrying it to remind himself of what mattered, carrying it to the library where he went to think, and that knowing he had been carrying it made her feel things she did not have words for. She did not know that Arthur Whitfield had spent 2.5 years getting his affairs, and not just his business affairs, in order. That he had spent those years not simply recovering from a cardiac episode, but deliberately and methodically rebuilding the life that his priorities had dismantled without his quite noticing. That he had retired from the active leadership of Whitfield Development Group and turned it over to a board he trusted and had spent the time he recovered with doing the actual work of becoming the father he had told Eleanor he had not been. That he had dinner with Caroline every Sunday. That he had learned to be present in the specific and difficult way that requires you to put down the thing you are carrying and simply be in the room with the person who is there. She did not know any of that. What she knew was her ward, her patients, her garden, and the quiet dignity of a life that fit her the way well-worn things fit, comfortably, completely, without excess. It was a Wednesday in September, 25 years after the night she had first held Arthur Whitfield's hand in room 408, when the knock came at her door. Eleanor had retired from Maplewood Regional 4 months earlier, at 66, after a retirement celebration that had involved a cake shaped inexplicably like a stethoscope and so many cards that she had run out of places to put them and had eventually stacked them in a decorative basket in the hallway, which she walked past every morning and which still made her feel a warmth she did not quite have words for. She had been spending her retirement gardening with renewed intensity, reading, and volunteering twice a week at the county hospice, because it turned out that a person does not simply stop needing to show up just because the overnight shifts are finished. It was mid-afternoon. She was in the back garden, arguing with a particularly stubborn stretch of bindweed, when she heard the knock. She peeled off her gardening gloves and came through the house and opened the front door. A woman stood on her porch. 48, perhaps. Dark eyes that Eleanor recognized before she recognized anything else. Well-dressed, not ostentatiously, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to occupy space without apology. She was carrying a small bunch of flowers, the grocery store kind, unassuming. But they had clearly been chosen with some care because they were Eleanor's favorite color, which was a deep, quiet gold. Eleanor did not know how she knew to choose gold flowers. She would find out later. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor looked at those dark eyes and felt the particular quality of recognition that happens when you encounter something you thought had moved entirely into the past and discover it has been waiting in a closer room than you realized. "Caroline," she said. The woman's composure shifted slightly at the sound of her name, the way composure shifts when someone is trying very hard and the trying becomes briefly visible. "Yes," she said. She offered the flowers, which Eleanor took. "I am sorry to arrive without warning. I have your address from—" She paused, choosing her words the way her father had always chosen his. "From a mutual acquaintance who felt you might not mind a visit. I can leave if you would rather. I will understand." Eleanor stepped back from the door. "Please come in," she said. "I was just about to make tea." She led Caroline through the hallway with its basket of retirement cards, through the sitting room where Barnabas's replacement, a gray cat named Edmund, was arranged on the window seat with aristocratic indifference, and into the kitchen where the September light came through the window above the sink in the particular gold that Eleanor had always loved about afternoons in that room. She put the kettle on. She found a vase for the flowers. She moved through the small rituals of hospitality that create enough space and time for the important things to arrange themselves. Caroline sat at the kitchen table. She had her hands folded in front of her, and Eleanor recognized the posture from 25 years ago, the careful composure of a woman who was feeling something large and had organized herself around it so that she could still function. "Your father," Eleanor said, setting down 2 cups. "How is he?" Caroline was quiet for a moment. "He passed away," she said. 18 months ago. His heart again, but peacefully at home. He had 18 good months' warning to put things in order, which is more than most people get, and he used them well." Eleanor set the teapot down and sat across from her. "I am very sorry," she said. She meant it completely. "He was better at the end," Caroline said. "Better than he had been in years," which sounds like a strange thing to say, but I mean he was present. He had learned to be present. She looked at her hands. "He had been working on that since the hospital. Since you—" Eleanor did not say anything. "He talked about you," Caroline continued. "Not constantly, not in a maudlin way. But sometimes, when he was explaining something about why he was making certain choices, he would reference that week. He would say something like, 'There was a nurse who sat with me in the dark when I was afraid, and she did it without being asked and without expecting anything, and I have been thinking about what that means.'" The kettle had settled. Eleanor poured the tea. "He left instructions," Caroline said. "When he reorganized his estate in those final months, he left very specific instructions about certain things." She reached into the bag she had been carrying and placed a sealed envelope on the table between them. "This is part of that." She paused. "I want you to understand something before you open it. My father was not a sentimental man by temperament. He was precise. He was deliberate. Everything he did meant exactly what it appeared to mean. When he wrote that letter, he wrote it carefully and with full intention." She met Eleanor's eyes. "He said to me, 'Find the woman who stayed. Find the nurse who held my hand. Tell her that the life she helped save went on to do something worth saving.'" The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the September garden moved slightly in a breeze that was not quite autumn yet but was practicing. Eleanor looked at the envelope on the table. She did not reach for it immediately. She was doing what she always did in important moments, which was giving them the space they deserved before moving into them. "He did not owe me anything," she said. "I want you to know that I am telling you the truth when I say that. What I did that night was what the moment required. It was not a sacrifice. It was not unusual. I have done it many times for many patients. What was unusual about your father was that he was," she paused, choosing honestly, "a man who was clearly in the middle of something important. The photograph of you. The things he said when he came back to consciousness. He was a man who was trying to get somewhere and was afraid he might not make it. That was why I stayed." Caroline's eyes were bright with something she was managing carefully. "He made it," she said quietly. "He made it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Eleanor reached across the table and picked up the envelope. It was heavy, substantial, the kind of envelope that contains a document rather than simply a letter. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she did not recognize but that struck her immediately as deliberate, each letter placed with care. She opened it. Inside was a letter, 3 pages, handwritten on heavy paper, and beneath the letter a second sealed envelope, smaller, with a law firm's return address in Columbus, Ohio. She read the letter. She read it once, and then she sat for a moment, and then she read it again more slowly. Arthur Whitfield had written to her about the night in room 408. He had written about hearing her voice in the dark, about the specific and particular quality of not being alone that her presence had created, about how he had understood in those hours that he had been alone in the way that matters, not physically but essentially for a very long time, and that her presence had reminded him of what it felt like for that to not be true. He wrote without sentimentality, the way Caroline had described, precisely and deliberately. He wrote that he had spent the years since that night attempting to be worth saving. He wrote that he believed he had managed it imperfectly but genuinely. He wrote about Caroline. He wrote about Sunday dinners. He wrote about a photograph he had been carrying the night his heart stopped, and why. And then, in the final paragraphs, he wrote about what he was leaving her. Not as recompense, he was careful to say, because the word recompense implied a transaction and what had happened in room 408 was not a transaction. It was simply a human being choosing, at some cost to her own ease, to remain present with another human being in the dark. He was not paying for that. He was honoring it. Eleanor set the letter down on the table. Her hands were very steady. That was always how she received large things, with steadiness, because she had learned that steadiness was a form of respect for the weight of what you were being given. She looked at Caroline across the table. Caroline looked back at her. "What is in the second envelope," Eleanor said, "is going to change my life. Isn't it?" "It is," Caroline said quietly. "Yes. And I want you to know because I think you would want to know that my father thought about this for 2.5 years. He did not make this decision quickly or lightly. He made it the way he made all his final decisions, which was with complete clarity about what mattered and why." Eleanor looked at the sealed envelope from the law firm. She thought about a man in a parking garage who had been on his way to have dinner with his daughter. She thought about 4 hours and 17 minutes. She thought about a Tuesday in February when the cold had been the kind that settled in the bones. She thought about what showing up actually costs and what it actually means, and how very rarely anyone ever truly accounts for either. She picked up the second envelope. She opened it, and her life, which had been a good and quiet and full life, began to become something else entirely. The letter from the law firm was written in the precise, measured language that lawyers use when they are delivering something significant and want to make certain there is no ambiguity about any part of it. Eleanor read it twice at the kitchen table while her tea went cold and Caroline sat across from her with the particular stillness of someone who has already absorbed a piece of news and is now watching someone else absorb it for the first time. The document confirmed that Arthur Whitfield, in the reorganization of his estate conducted in the final 18 months of his life, had established a trust in Eleanor's name. The trust contained a sum that Eleanor read and then had to set the paper down for a moment before she could read again. $2.4 million, held in a managed account, available to her immediately upon the completion of a brief legal process that the firm had already initiated on her behalf. Additionally, a property. A house in the small town of Sycamore Falls, 40 minutes east of Millbrook, which Arthur had purchased 3 years ago and maintained for this specific purpose. A house with a garden, the letter noted, because his daughter had told him that the nurse who stayed grew things, and he had wanted there to be space for that. Eleanor put the document down on the table and looked at her hands. She had spent 40 years as a nurse. She had been careful with her money the way people are careful when they grow up in households where money required carefulness, and she owned her small house outright and had a retirement account that was comfortable, genuinely comfortable, which was more than many people managed. She was not a woman who thought of herself as lacking. She had never sat in this kitchen and felt the specific ache of wanting something she could not have. But $2.4 million was not a number from her life. It was a number from a different kind of story entirely, and she sat with it for a long moment, feeling it settle into the room the way large things settle, displacing the air slightly, rearranging what ordinary meant. "Caroline," she said finally, "I need you to understand something." Caroline looked at her steadily. Her hands were folded on the table. She had the posture of someone who had prepared herself for a range of responses and was simply waiting to see which one arrived. "I did not stay with your father that night because I expected anything from it," Eleanor said. "I did not stay because I calculated that he was a wealthy man and that proximity to his suffering might eventually produce a return. I stayed because he was afraid and alone and I was in the room. That is the complete account of my reasoning." "I know that," Caroline said. "I am telling you not because I think you doubt it," Eleanor said. "I am telling you because I need to hear myself say it before I think about any of this further. I need the record to be clear, at least in this kitchen." Caroline's expression shifted in the way expressions shift when someone says something that unexpectedly reaches a place the person was trying to protect. She looked at the window for a moment. "My father understood that," she said. "That is precisely why he did this. He was a man who spent most of his life in a world where everything had a price and everyone was calculating it. He knew the difference between someone who sat with him because it was strategically useful and someone who sat with him because it was simply right. He had encountered very little of the second kind." She looked back at Eleanor. He did not want to reward a transaction. He wanted to honor a person. There is a difference, and he knew it, and he thought about it for 2.5 years, which is as long as he had. Eleanor picked up the letter from the law firm again and looked at it without reading it. The numbers were still there. The house in Sycamore Falls was still there. She thought about what showing up had cost her, honestly and completely. The honest answer was that it had cost her very little. She had lost 47 minutes of charting time she had made up later. She had gone home that morning slightly more tired than usual. She had thought about Arthur Whitfield occasionally over the years in the way she thought about all the patients who had moved through her ward and left their particular impressions. None of that was suffering. None of that was sacrifice in any meaningful sense. And yet here was this kitchen, and this document, and Caroline with her dark eyes and her careful composure, telling her that those 4 hours and 17 minutes had reverberated outward into 25 years of a man's life and had contributed, in ways she could not have planned and had not imagined, to the fact that he had actually arrived at the dinner in Columbus, and that Sunday dinners had become a habit, and that a photograph of a laughing daughter had stopped being a reminder of what he was missing and had become instead a record of what he had found his way back to. That, she thought, was not nothing. That was actually everything. "Tell me about him," Eleanor said. "Tell me about the 25 years. Caroline told her. She talked for a long time, the way people talk when they have been carrying something that finally has a place to be set down. She talked about the years before the hospital, the father who was present in the physical sense but absent in every way that mattered, the large houses and the excellent schools and the birthday cards signed by an assistant because he was traveling, the particular loneliness of being a wealthy child whose parents' attention was the one resource that could not be purchased. She talked about it without bitterness, which Eleanor noted and respected, because the absence of bitterness in such an account is itself a form of extraordinary work that someone has to have done. She talked about the change that began after that February. How it started small, a phone call that lasted longer than expected, a dinner that he did not cut short because of a conference call, a Sunday that became 2 Sundays that became a habit. How he had arrived at her apartment one afternoon with a bottle of wine and a yellow legal pad on which he had written a list of things he wanted to say to her that he had not said, and how he had worked through the list item by item with the methodical sincerity of a man who understood that the time for elegance had passed and what was required now was simply honesty in the plainest form it could take. "I did not know what to do with him at first," Caroline said. She was not smiling exactly, but there was something warm in her expression that was adjacent to a smile. "I had spent 23 years building a version of myself that did not require him to show up. And then he started showing up, and I had to figure out what to do with all the architecture I had constructed around his absence." She was quiet for a moment. He was patient with that. He said he had earned my caution and intended to outlast it. He very nearly did. "Nearly," Eleanor said gently. "His heart was always the thing," Caroline said. "We had 3 good years. Real years. I have 3 years of Sunday dinners and a father who knew the names of my friends and remembered what I had told him the week before and called me on a Wednesday just to say he had seen something that made him think of me." She paused. 3 years is not very much, but it is also not nothing. He used to say that. He would say, 3 years of the right thing is worth more than 30 years of the wrong thing. I think he believed it. I am working on believing it myself. Eleanor looked at this woman across her kitchen table, this 48-year-old woman who had grown up in the specific loneliness of a large house and had built herself into someone remarkable in spite of it, or perhaps because of it, because these things are rarely simple, and felt something she recognized from 25 years of sitting beside people in difficult moments. She felt the particular quality of being in the presence of someone who needed, not to be saved, not to be advised, but simply to be witnessed. You have done well, Eleanor said quietly. That was a hard thing to grow up in and a harder thing to forgive, and from what you are telling me you managed both. That is not small. Caroline looked at her for a moment. Then she said, he said you would be like this. Like what? He said you would receive everything he told you about that night as simply having done what was required, and that you would mean it, and that was precisely the point. He said he had spent his whole professional life surrounded by people who did things and expected credit for the doing, and that you had done something meaningful and the thought of credit for it had genuinely not occurred to you. He said it was the most instructive thing he had witnessed in decades. She paused. He said he had tried to learn from it. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he sounds like he became a good man. He became a better one, Caroline said. Which is actually harder. They sat together for another hour. Eleanor made fresh tea and found the shortbread she kept in the tin above the refrigerator, and they ate it at the kitchen table while the September afternoon moved through the window and Edmund the cat relocated from the window seat to the floor near Caroline's chair, which was his version of a welcome. Eleanor asked about the house in Sycamore Falls. Caroline described it as her father had described it to her. A white farmhouse on a small piece of land at the edge of a town that was the right size, not too small to feel forgotten, not too large to feel anonymous. A kitchen with good light. A garden that had been tended by a service for 3 years but was waiting for someone to make it particular, to give it the specific character that only comes from someone who actually knows what they are doing with growing things. He drove out to see it once a month, Caroline said. After he bought it, he would drive out there on a Sunday morning and walk the property and stand in the kitchen and then drive back. She smiled slightly. He told me it helped him feel certain that he was doing the right thing. Eleanor shook her head slowly. Not at the gesture itself, which was generous and careful and clearly right in the way that some things simply are, but at the image of this man driving 40 minutes on Sunday mornings to stand in a kitchen and be certain. There was something in that image that captured everything she had understood about him from those 4 hours and 17 minutes, the core of a man who did not do things halfway, who when he understood something, moved toward it with his whole weight. I will need to think about it, Eleanor said. Not the gesture. I understand the gesture and I accept it, and I want you to know that I am receiving it in the spirit in which it was given, which is to say without any of the discomfort I might feel if I thought it was about obligation or transaction. She looked at Caroline steadily. I accept it because your father spent 2.5 years making certain it was the right thing to do, and I trust that he knew the difference between the right thing and the easier thing. But I will need to think about what I do with it. I am 66 years old and I have a life here and a garden and a volunteer commitment and a cat who dislikes travel. I will need to think about what the next chapter looks like. Of course, Caroline said. There is no urgency. The trust is already established. The property will wait. She paused. I am not here to manage your decision. I am here because my father asked me to find you and give you the letter and tell you that the life he asked you to help save went on to do something worth saving. That was the message. Everything else is yours to do with as you choose. Eleanor looked at her. You came all this way to deliver a message. I came all this way because, Caroline said, and then stopped, and reorganized herself slightly in the way her father had reorganized himself before saying something honest. I came because he was my father and he loved you, not romantically. She added, the qualification clear and easy, not the way people sometimes assume when a dying man leaves something significant to a woman. He loved you the way you love a fixed point, the way you love something that reminded you, at a moment when you had almost forgotten, what it was possible for a human being to be. She looked at Eleanor directly. I wanted to meet that person. I wanted to see for myself what she was like. And Eleanor said gently, what is she like? Caroline smiled. Exactly what he said. She reached down to where Edmund had settled against her ankle and put her hand gently on his gray back. He opened one eye, decided this was acceptable, and closed it again. She is exactly what he said. Eleanor walked Caroline to the door at 5:30, when the September light had turned the deep gold of early evening. They stood on the porch for a moment, not awkwardly, but with the particular quality of two people who have covered a great deal of important ground in a short time and are working out what, if anything, comes next. "I would like to stay in touch," Eleanor said, "if you are willing. Not because of the trust or the house. Because you are someone worth knowing, and I think your father would agree." Caroline looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes. "I would like that very much," she said. She walked to her car, a sensible dark blue sedan that suited her. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched her go. When the car had turned at the end of the street, she went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the papers still spread across it. She sat there for a long time. She thought about 40 years of overnight shifts, of the particular mathematics of a nursing life, the giving that accumulates across decades into something enormous without ever drawing attention to itself because it is given incrementally, one shift at a time, one room at a time, one hand held in the dark at a time. She thought about all the patients she had sat with who had not been Arthur Whitfield, who had not had the resources or the clarity to circle back, who had passed through her ward and out the other side of whatever they were facing and gone on with their lives in the ordinary ways that lives go on. She did not feel any difference between what she had given them and what she had given him. The night in room 408 had not been special in her ledger. It had been Tuesday, and yet it had mattered. It had mattered in ways she could not have seen from inside it, in ways that ramp-led outward through years and changed the quality of a man's remaining time on earth and changed the quality of his daughter's relationship with him and changed the Sunday dinners in Columbus and changed the laughing photograph from a symbol of loss to a symbol of return. You cannot know, she thought, when you are doing the thing, what the thing will mean. You cannot calculate it. You cannot see the radius of it from inside it. You can only do it because it is what the moment requires and you are the person in the room. She thought about what Caroline had said. The life he asked you to help save went on to do something worth saving. She picked up the letter from the law firm and folded it carefully and placed it back in its envelope. She did the same with Arthur's handwritten letter, folding it along its original creases, feeling the weight of the good paper. She put both envelopes together and held them for a moment. Then she got up, put on the kettle for the third time that afternoon, went to the window above the sink, and looked at her garden in the September gold. The bindweed, she noted, was not going to sort itself out. She put on her gardening gloves. She went back outside. She did not think of herself, standing there in the last of the afternoon light pulling at the stubborn roots of something unwanted, as someone whose life was about to change significantly. She thought of herself as someone who had received something important and needed a little time with her hands in the ground before she knew what to do with it. This was how she had always processed important things. The garden had been her thinking place since she was 34 years old and had moved into this small house and discovered that the act of growing things created a particular quality of mental space that nothing else quite matched. She stayed in the garden until the light was gone. Then she went inside, washed her hands, fed Edmund, and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and wrote down everything she was thinking in the practical, organized way she had always approached decisions that required clarity. She wrote down what she had, what she valued, what she needed, what the offer represented, and what she wanted the next 10 years to look like. She wrote for a long time. When she finished, she read back what she had written. Then she picked up the phone and called her friend Joan. Joan had known her for 25 years. Joan had sat across from her through every important conversation Eleanor had ever needed to have with another human being. Joan could be trusted to say the thing that was true rather than the thing that was comfortable, which was exactly the quality Eleanor required right now. She told Joan everything. The knock on the door, the envelope, the letter, the numbers, the house in Sycamore Falls, the drive Arthur Whitfield had made every Sunday to stand in the kitchen of a house he had bought for a nurse he had never forgotten. Joan was quiet for a long time after Eleanor finished. Then she said, "Eleanor Marsh, if you do not take this, I will never speak to you again." Eleanor laughed, which was what she had needed. She realized, more than anything else. She had needed to laugh before she could think clearly. "It is an enormous amount of money," Eleanor said. "Yes." I do not know what to do with an enormous amount of money. You will figure it out. You figured out everything else. I would have to move, Eleanor said. If I take the house. You have been talking about moving for 6 years, Joan said. You have been saying this house is too large for one person since the year your mother passed. You have been saying the garden deserves more attention than you can give it while you are working. You have been saying you want to be somewhere a little quieter. This is all of that, Eleanor. It arrived differently than you expected it to arrive, but it is still all of that. Eleanor looked at Edmund, who was sitting on the kitchen counter in the dignified but technically prohibited position he adopted whenever he felt the household needed his supervision. He drove there on Sunday mornings, Eleanor said, to make sure he was doing the right thing. Then he was sure, Joan said, which means you are allowed to be sure too. Eleanor slept that night with the 2 envelopes on the bedside table. Not because she needed to be near them, but because she had learned that sleeping near a decision sometimes helped, the way proximity to anything important helps you understand what you actually feel about it when the day's noise is gone and it is just you and the dark and the truth. In the morning, she knew. She called the law firm in Columbus at 9 o'clock and told them she would like to begin the process. She called Joan and said 2 words. She called Caroline and the conversation was brief and warm and left both of them with something that felt like the beginning of an actual thing rather than the end of an old one. Then she put on her coat and drove 40 minutes east, to Sycamore Falls, because she needed to see the kitchen. The house was at the edge of town on a street that was quiet without being empty, the best kind of quiet. White clapboard, dark green shutters, a porch that faced east and would catch the morning light. The service that had been maintaining it had kept it clean and well-ordered, but Eleanor could see immediately that it had been waiting for something more than maintenance. Gardens do not thrive under maintenance alone. They require intention. The property manager let her in and gave her the key and stood back in the way of someone who understood that a person sometimes needs to be alone in a space to hear what it is telling them. Eleanor walked through the rooms. They were good rooms, not grand, not the kind of rooms that announce themselves, but the kind that would become whatever you needed them to become because they had good bones and enough light and the proportions were right in the way that proportions sometimes are when someone thought carefully about the spaces people actually need. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. The window above the sink faced the back garden. She could see from where she stood that it was a substantial piece of land, somewhat overgrown at the edges, with the particular quality of a garden that has been tended by hands that know technique but not personality. It needed someone who knew what she wanted from it. She thought about Arthur Whitfield standing in this kitchen on Sunday mornings, alone, certain. She looked out the window at the overgrown garden. She thought about 40 years of showing up. She thought about the ward and the patients and the overnight shifts and Joan's toast and the basket of retirement cards in her hallway. She thought about 4 hours and 17 minutes in a room at the end of a quiet corridor when a man had been afraid and she had stayed. She thought about what it meant that staying had mattered that much. Not the money, not the house, though those things were real and significant and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She meant the fact of it. The fact that those 4 hours had gone on reverberating through a man's life and had changed its direction and had reached back across 25 years and landed on her doorstep in the form of a woman with dark eyes and grocery store flowers in the color gold. It meant that the quiet things accumulated. It meant that the Tuesday nights added up to something you could not see from inside them. It meant that showing up, which she had always understood as simply what you did, was in fact one of the most consequential choices a human being could make, repeated quietly and without fanfare across decades until it became the whole shape of a life. She put her hand on the windowsill and looked at the garden. A small bird landed on the overgrown edge of what had once been a very organized bed of something she could not quite identify from this distance. Something that had self-seeded chaotically across the years and needed someone to make a decision about it. She could make that decision. She could make a great many decisions, she thought, with $2.4 million and a white farmhouse with good bones and a garden that was waiting. She stayed for an hour. When she left, she locked the front door with the key the property manager had given her. And she put the key in her coat pocket. And she drove back to Millbrook thinking about what she wanted to grow. 3 months later, on a cold December afternoon, Eleanor Marsh moved into the house in Sycamore Falls. She did it without fuss. Joan helped her pack. A local moving company handled the furniture. Edmund the cat traveled in his carrier with the expression of a dignitary managing a difficult diplomatic situation. She had given notice to the hospice in Millbrook, who had been genuinely sorry to lose her and whom she had promised to assist in finding a suitable replacement. She had recommended 2 former colleagues with the kind of unreserved enthusiasm that comes from actually knowing someone's work. She had sold her house in Millbrook to a young couple who were expecting their first child and who had stood in the kitchen and looked at each other the way couples look at each other when they know something is right, and Eleanor had felt pleased about that in the specific and settled way she felt pleased about things that were going where they were supposed to go. She had also, in the weeks before the move, done something she had not mentioned to Joan or Caroline or anyone else, because she had wanted to think it through completely before she talked about it. She had sat down with the trust documents and the financial advisor the law firm had connected her with, a patient and thoughtful man named Robert, who had the manner of someone who genuinely believed that money was a tool rather than a destination, which Eleanor found immediately reassuring. She had spent 2 sessions with Robert working through what the money meant in practical terms and what she wanted it to mean in purpose. She did not want to simply have the money. She was 66 years old, and she had never been motivated by accumulation, and she was not going to start now. She wanted the money to do something, the way Arthur had wanted his remaining years to do something. She wanted it to have intention. She had an idea. She had been carrying it since the afternoon at the kitchen table when she had written down everything she was thinking, because among the things she had written was a question. She had written, "What do I know how to do?" And the answer was clear and had always been clear. She knew how to show up. She knew how to be present with people in the moments when presence was the most necessary and the least available thing. She knew how to sit in a chair beside a hospital bed at 3 in the morning and be the voice that said, "You are safe, you are not alone, you do not need to be afraid right now." She knew that the people who needed that most were often the people who had no one to provide it. The elderly patients on the overnight wards who had outlived their visitors. The patients in long-term care whose families were far away or exhausted or had simply, quietly stopped coming. The dying people in hospice beds who deserved a hand to hold in the dark and did not always have one. She had seen it for 40 years. She had done what she could within the limits of a shift and a ward and the demands on her time. But she had always known that the need was larger than any single nurse could address. She was not a single nurse anymore. She was a retired nurse with $2.4 million and a white farmhouse with good bones and a garden she was going to make very particular, and she had an idea. She was going to build something. Not alone. She was 66 and realistic about her own limits, which was one of the things she had learned from 40 years of working in conditions that demanded honest self-assessment. She was going to need people, the right people, people who understood what she understood about presence and about the specific value of staying when staying was inconvenient. She was going to need Caroline. The thought arrived with a certainty that surprised her only in its timing, not in its substance. She had felt since the afternoon at the kitchen table that Caroline was somehow part of whatever came next, not because Arthur had arranged it, not because she felt any obligation to the connection, but because Caroline was the kind of person you want beside you when you are trying to do something that matters. The kind of person who has done the hard interior work and come out the other side with clarity. The kind of person who drove 4 hours to deliver a message because her father had asked her to and because she had wanted to see for herself. Eleanor made dinner that first evening in the new house with the satisfaction of a person who has arrived somewhere correctly. The kitchen had good light even in December, which she had hoped but not been certain about. Edmund conducted a thorough inspection of every room and settled finally on the window seat in the sitting room with the expression of someone who had found the arrangement acceptable. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the back garden in the December dark. The overgrown edges were invisible now, just the shapes of things, dark against the lighter dark of the winter sky. In the spring, she thought, she would know what was there. She would see what had been waiting under the overgrowth, what was worth keeping, what needed to go, what needed planting from scratch. She thought that was probably a reasonable description of what she was doing generally. She called Caroline after dinner. It was the 3rd time they had spoken since September, the earlier 2 calls brief and warm, establishing the reality of the connection. This call was longer. Eleanor told her about the house, about Edmund's inspection, about the garden in the December dark. Caroline laughed at the right moments, which Eleanor noted as a quality in its own right. Then Eleanor said, I want to tell you about an idea I have been thinking about. Caroline said, I am listening. Eleanor told her. She talked for 20 minutes, laying out what she was thinking with the organized clarity she had always brought to plans, not tentatively, not as a proposal awaiting permission, but as a person who has thought something through and knows what she knows. She talked about the model, the funding, what she understood and what she did not yet understand, the gaps she needed people to fill. When she finished, Caroline was quiet for a moment. The same quality of quiet her father had, Eleanor noted. The quiet of someone thinking rather than simply waiting for their turn. I have been thinking about something similar, Caroline said. Not the same shape, but the same instinct. I have been trying to figure out what to do with what my father left me that would be. She paused, adequate to who he became. I have resources and I have time, and I have been sitting with both of them for 18 months trying to understand what they are for. Eleanor waited. I think you just told me, Caroline said. The line was quiet for a moment, but it was the comfortable quiet of two people who have found something real and are taking a moment to recognize it. Tell me the gaps, Caroline said. Tell me what you need and I will tell you what I have, and we will figure out what this can become. Outside the kitchen window, the December garden sat in its winter dark, waiting for spring, waiting for someone to come and make it particular, waiting to become what it was always going to be once the right person arrived with intention and the willingness to begin. Eleanor Marsh put her hand on the windowsill of her new kitchen and began to tell Caroline Whitfield what she needed. They talked until midnight. In the morning, Eleanor put on her coat and her gardening gloves and went outside in the December cold and began to learn what was there. Spring arrived in Sycamore Falls the way it arrived in small towns everywhere, gradually and then all at once, the way important things tend to arrive when you have stopped watching for them and simply gone about your life. Eleanor had spent the winter months doing 3 things simultaneously, which was not unusual for her because she had always been a person who moved on multiple tracks at once, the natural disposition of someone who had spent 4 decades managing a cardiac ward where 4 different things required immediate attention at any given moment, and the ability to hold all of them clearly was simply the baseline requirement of survival. She was learning her garden. This was the first track, and in some ways the most important, because the garden was teaching her things about the property and about herself and about patience that she needed to know before she could do the other 2 things well. She spent December and January mapping what was there, getting her hands into the cold earth and understanding the soil, tracing the edges of beds that had once been intentional and had gone rogue over years of maintenance without vision. By February she had a plan. By March she had begun executing it, which meant a great deal of removing before any adding, which she understood was usually the correct order of operations. She was also working with Robert, the financial advisor, and with a lawyer named Patricia Osei whom Caroline had recommended and who turned out to be exactly the kind of person Eleanor needed, direct, creative, deeply knowledgeable about the specific legal structures that govern charitable organizations, and entirely unintimidated by the scope of what Eleanor was describing. Patricia had spent 20 years helping people build things that mattered, and she had the manner of someone who had seen enough of the world to know the difference between an idea that had energy behind it and an idea that was simply optimism wearing ambition's clothing. Eleanor's idea, Patricia told her at the end of their second meeting, had energy behind it. The third track was Caroline. They spoke twice a week, sometimes more. Caroline had driven out to Sycamore Falls in January, ostensibly to see the house, genuinely to sit at Eleanor's kitchen table and work through the shape of what they were building together. She had arrived with a leather portfolio full of notes she had made since their midnight phone call in December, organized with the precision of someone who had learned from a father who built things that a plan without structure was simply a wish. Eleanor had recognized the quality of the preparation and had felt, sitting across from Caroline with her own notes spread across the table, something she had not expected to feel, which was the specific pleasure of working with someone who matched you. It had been a long time since Eleanor had worked with someone who matched her. They called it the Presence Project, which was Caroline's phrase, offered tentatively on that January afternoon and received by Eleanor immediately and with conviction because it was exactly right. The name said what it was without ornamentation. Presence. The specific and irreplaceable thing that money could not fully purchase and distance could not provide and good intentions alone could not deliver. The thing Eleanor had been providing, without naming it, for 40 years. The model was straightforward. which Eleanor had insisted on because she had seen enough well-intentioned organizations collapse under the weight of their own complexity to know that simplicity was not the enemy of ambition but the condition of its survival. Trained volunteer companions, rigorously selected and carefully prepared, placed with elderly patients in hospital and hospice settings who had no family available or present. Not medical professionals, not therapists, simply people who had been trained in the art of presence, who understood how to sit quietly without discomfort, how to speak or not speak as the moment required, how to hold a hand without needing the hand to do anything in return. Eleanor would train them herself initially because she was the person who knew how to do it and the knowledge needed to be transferable before it could scale. Caroline would handle the organizational architecture, the legal structure, the funding strategy, the partnerships with hospital systems that they would need to make the model work at any meaningful level. They were, Eleanor observed to Joan over the phone one February evening, surprisingly well-suited to this particular division of labor. Joan said, almost aggressively unsurprised by this development, because Joan had known Eleanor for 25 years and was entirely certain that Eleanor was not the kind of person retirement happened to, only the kind of person who redirected. By April, Patricia had completed the legal establishment of the Presence Project as a nonprofit organization. By May, Eleanor had recruited and trained the first cohort of 8 volunteers, people she had found through the hospice where she had volunteered in Millbrook, through the nursing community she had spent 40 years inside, through word of mouth in Sycamore Falls where she had begun, without particularly trying, to become a person the town knew. The volunteers were a varied group, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret, 2 college students studying social work, a man named Gerald who had retired from a career in insurance and had discovered in retirement that what he wanted was to be useful in a way that felt real, a woman named Sue Jean who had lost her own mother in a hospital without anyone beside her and had never quite recovered from it and had decided that recovery was not the right goal, action was. Eleanor trained them on Tuesday and Thursday evenings in the sitting room of the farmhouse, which was large enough for 10 people if you arranged the chairs correctly and opened the connecting doors to the hallway. Edmund supervised from the window seat with the expression of someone who found the proceedings acceptable but would prefer if people kept their voices at a moderate volume. She taught them what she knew. She taught them that presence was not performance, that the temptation to say something meaningful was almost always less useful than the willingness to say nothing at all. She taught them that a hand held in the dark was not a small thing and should never be treated as one. She taught them the specific body language of someone who was genuinely staying rather than waiting to leave, which turned out to be a thing people could feel even when they could not articulate it, even when they were unconscious, especially when they were unconscious because the body knows before the mind does when someone is truly there. She taught them about Arthur Whitfield, not by name but by story. She told them about a man who had been alone in a parking garage and had arrived at a hospital without any identification, and how what she had known about him by the end of that night was not his name or his net worth but the feel of his hand in the dark and the quality of his breathing when the fear receded slightly and the grip of his fingers when he surfaced toward consciousness and needed to know he was not alone. She told them that this was the information that mattered. The rest was administrative. Sue Jean cried quietly during that particular session. She did not apologize for it. Eleanor appreciated that. By June, the first 8 volunteers were placed. The Presence Project had formal agreements with Maplewood Regional Hospital, where Eleanor had spent 25 years, and with 2 hospice facilities in the surrounding county. The response from the nursing staff at Maplewood was something Eleanor had not fully prepared herself for, which was the specific, exhausted gratitude of people who had known the need was there and had been unable to fill it within the constraints of their own workloads. The charge nurse on the overnight cardiac ward, a woman named Denise who had been a nursing student during Eleanor's final years and had learned a great deal from her, emailed Eleanor 2 weeks after the first volunteers were placed to say that the night shift felt different and that she did not entirely know how to quantify that but wanted Eleanor to know. Eleanor printed the email. She put it in a folder she had started keeping for things she wanted to remember. Caroline drove out to Sycamore Falls in late June for the first quarterly review, which was what they called it when they sat at the kitchen table with their separate notebooks and went through everything honestly. What was working, what needed adjustment, what they had not anticipated, what the numbers said, what the numbers did not say. The numbers were encouraging. The qualitative reports were more than encouraging. They were the kind of reports that made Eleanor sit very still for a moment when she read them, because they described moments she recognized with the precision of someone describing places she had lived. A volunteer named Gerald had sat with an 81-year-old man named Raymond for 6 hours on a Tuesday night when Raymond's only son was on an international flight and could not be reached. And Raymond had held Gerald's hand and told him about the house he had built with his own hands in 1971, and the vegetable garden his wife had kept there for 30 years. And Gerald had listened to every word, and Raymond had died peacefully at 4 in the morning with someone beside him who knew about the vegetable garden. Eleanor read that report sitting at her kitchen table on a Wednesday morning in June, and she was not ashamed of the fact that she had to set it down and take a moment. "This is working," Caroline said at the quarterly review, with the directness Eleanor had come to rely on. Not working in the sense that things are running smoothly, which they are, but working in the sense that it is doing what you said it would do. "Yes," Eleanor said. "What do you need to scale it?" Eleanor had thought about this carefully. "More trainers," she said. "I cannot train every cohort myself indefinitely. The model breaks if it depends on one person." She looked at her notes. "I need to identify 2 or 3 people from the current cohort who can learn to train others. The training has to be transferable without losing what makes it effective." She paused. "That is the hard part. What makes it effective is very specific and very human and very difficult to systematize without diluting it." Caroline looked at her across the table. "You systematized it once already," she said. "When you trained the first cohort. You found a way to teach something that is essentially unteachable." Eleanor considered this. "I taught them the conditions," she said. "The posture, the stillness, the particular quality of attention. I cannot teach them what is underneath it, which is genuinely caring whether the person in the room is afraid." She looked at her notes. "What I can do is select for it. I can find people who already have it and teach them the conditions. That is the selection problem. That is where most of the work is. Then that is what we solve next," Caroline said. She made a note. She always made notes in the same precise way her father had apparently made notes. Eleanor understood this now, as something passed between them in those Sunday dinners, the habit of recording what mattered. "I want to fund a fellowship program. 6 people a year, fully supported, trained by you, placed in partnership facilities. We build the pipeline. Within 5 years you have a training core that can operate independently of any single person." Eleanor looked at her across the table for a moment. "Your father would have liked this very much," she said. Caroline smiled the smile that was adjacent to something larger that she kept carefully managed. "He would have had 17 questions about the implementation timeline," she said. "And he would have been right to ask them." She looked at her notebook. "I have 11. Can we start there?" They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, and Eleanor made dinner and they ate at the kitchen table the way they had been eating at the kitchen table for 6 months, with the easy comfort of people who have become genuinely necessary to each other in the way that happens when 2 people are building something real together and have stopped performing and started simply working. After dinner, they sat on the porch in the June dark and Eleanor told Caroline about Raymond and the house he had built and the vegetable garden, and Caroline was quiet for a long time after. "This is what the money is for," Caroline said finally. Not as a statement requiring agreement, but as the specific relief of a person who has been waiting 18 months to understand something and has finally understood it. "Yes," Eleanor said. "That is exactly what it is for." Summer moved through the farmhouse and the garden and the Presence Project with the unhurried quality of things going right. Eleanor's garden had come into its own by July. The chaos of the overgrown years resolved into something that was unmistakably hers, practical and beautiful in the way things are beautiful when they are also useful. Herbs along the south-facing bed, tomatoes in the warmest corner, a long border of flowers that served no purpose except being lovely, which Eleanor had decided was purpose enough. She had made friends in Sycamore Falls in the quiet, organic way that suits some people better than others. The woman at the post office whose name was Helen, and who knew everything about the town's history, and shared it willingly if you had time to stand at the counter for 20 minutes, which Eleanor generally did. The owner of the small hardware store 2 blocks from the main intersection, a man named Phil who had initially been skeptical of a retired nurse buying a farmhouse alone, but had revised his assessment entirely when Eleanor had accurately diagnosed a problem with his store's electrical panel on the basis of a sound it was making and had recommended the right electrician without being asked. She had established a volunteer position at the county library's program for elderly residents who were beginning to lose their independence and needed someone to sit with them during the process of learning to use technology that their grandchildren had sent them, and that none of them had wanted but all of them secretly appreciated once they understood that it connected them to things they had missed. Eleanor went on Tuesday mornings. She was very good at it. She was very good at the specific work of being with someone while they encountered something new and frightening and needed the encounter not to be shameful. Joan visited in August and spent 4 days and declared the garden exceptional and Edmund's new window seat even more suited to his personality than the old one, which was high praise from Joan, who had opinions about most things and was not liberal with the positive ones. What Joan also said on the last evening of her visit, when they were sitting on the porch with the particular openness that comes at the end of time together when you know departure is close and it frees you to say the real things, was that Eleanor looked different. Different how? Eleanor asked. Joan considered this with the seriousness she brought to accurate description. Settled, she said finally. You always seemed settled, but it was the settled of someone who has accepted what they have. This is the settled of someone who has what they actually need. Those are different kinds of settled, and you can see the difference if you know a person well enough. Eleanor thought about this for a while. Then she said, I think that might be right. Joan went home on Sunday morning and Eleanor stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked at the garden and thought that Joan was probably right, and that this was worth noting. The challenge arrived in October, the way challenges tended to arrive in Eleanor's experience, not dramatically, not with advance warning, but quietly in the form of a letter. The letter came from a man named Douglas Whitfield, and it took Eleanor a moment to connect the surname to Arthur before she realized, with a cold, clarifying recognition, that this was Arthur's younger brother. The letter was written in the language of legal threat, thinly veiled as personal concern. Douglas Whitfield expressed his belief that his late brother's estate had been disposed of in a manner that did not reflect Arthur's actual wishes, that the trust established in Eleanor's name was the product of undue influence exercised by a hospital employee over a vulnerable patient in a medical crisis, and that he intended to pursue appropriate legal remedies to ensure that his brother's assets were properly accounted for. He used the phrase hospital employee 3 times in the space of 2 pages. Eleanor noted this. She called Caroline before she had finished reading the letter. Caroline's response was immediate and very quiet. How much of the letter have you read? All of it. Are you all right? Eleanor considered the question honestly. I am angry, she said. Quietly angry, which is different from frightened. Good, Caroline said. That is the correct response. She paused. Douglas Whitfield has been angry about my father's estate for 18 months. He did not contest the will when it was read because the legal structure is airtight and he knew it. He is doing this now because the Presence Project has been receiving some attention and he has seen your name publicly associated with something my father funded, and he does not like what that implies about his assessment of the situation. What does he actually have? Eleanor asked. Nothing, Caroline said with the flat certainty of someone who knows the contents of a legal file well. He has an argument that no court has accepted and that Patricia will dismantle without significant effort. She paused. But it will cost you time, and it will cost you the particular discomfort of having your integrity questioned publicly, which I know is not nothing. It is not nothing, Eleanor agreed. But it is also not the worst thing that has happened to me in 66 years. No, Caroline said. It is not. She was quiet for a moment. I want to be in Sycamore Falls this weekend. We should sit with Patricia together and talk through the response. Not because you need managing. Because you should not have to manage this alone, and I do not want you to. Eleanor received this in the way she received most important things, simply and without deflection. Yes, she said. Come on Friday. I will make dinner. Douglas Whitfield filed his legal challenge in November. The filing received a small amount of local media coverage, the kind that led with phrases like billionaire's estate disputed and raised questions about the relationship between a wealthy man and the nurse who had treated him. It was not extensive coverage, but it was the specific kind of coverage that follows you into places you would rather it did not, and Eleanor encountered it twice in Sycamore Falls in the week following the filing. Once at the post office where Helen looked at her with a carefully neutral expression that told Eleanor she had read something, and once at the hardware store where Phil was demonstrably warmer than usual in the way people are demonstrably warmer when they are compensating for something they have seen or heard. Eleanor did not explain herself in either encounter. She thanked Helen for her mail and asked Phil about weatherproofing compound and went home and stood in her kitchen and allowed herself to feel the specific indignity of having 40 years of quiet integrity questioned by a man who had never met her, because the anger deserved to be felt before it could be set down. Then she set it down and called her first cohort of volunteers and told them what was happening and why, because they deserved to know and because the Presence Project was theirs as much as it was hers and they should not read about it anywhere other than directly from her. The response from her volunteers was something she would carry for the rest of her life. Gerald called back 20 minutes after she ended the group call and said, "What do you need from us?" Not a question about whether it was true or whether Eleanor had done something wrong. Simply, "What do you need?" Sujin sent a message that contained 3 sentences. "I know what you gave Raymond. I know what kind of person does that. Tell us how to help." The retired schoolteacher Margaret sent a longer message that Eleanor read in the kitchen with Edmund on her lap, and it covered, with the organizational clarity of a career educator, every specific thing Margaret had witnessed in the training sessions that spoke to Eleanor's character, offered as testimony if testimony was ever required, and concluded with the sentence, "I have been a teacher for 34 years and I know what it looks like when someone genuinely cares about people. And you should know that everyone in that sitting room knew it from the first session." Eleanor filed that one in the folder she kept for things she wanted to remember. Patricia was, as advertised, entirely unintimidated. She filed the response to Douglas Whitfield's challenge with the focused efficiency of someone who had been handed a weak argument to demolish and found the work satisfying. The response documented the timeline of Arthur's estate planning, which had begun more than 2 years before his death and had involved 3 separate legal consultations specifically designed to ensure that the disposition of the trust was unassailable. It documented the 2.5 years between Eleanor's care of Arthur and his first contact with the law firm on her behalf, which effectively neutralized the undue influence argument by the simple arithmetic of time. It included Arthur's own written statement, prepared at his lawyer's insistence during the estate reorganization, explaining in his precise and deliberate language exactly why he had established the trust and what it was intended to honor. The statement was 4 pages long. Eleanor read it when Patricia shared it with her as part of the case file, and she read it the way she had read Arthur's letter in her old kitchen on the September afternoon when Caroline had knocked on her door, once straight through, and then again more slowly, and then she set it down and sat with it. Arthur had written about the night in room 408 with the same precision he had brought to everything. He had written about hearing her voice in the dark. He had written about the specific quality of the fear he had felt when he surfaced toward consciousness and the specific quality of the relief when he understood he was not alone. He had written, in the 3rd paragraph, something that Eleanor had not expected and that stopped her completely when she read it. He had written that, in the years of his professional life, he had regularly tested people. He had presented them with situations that revealed character, opportunities to demonstrate whether they would do the right thing when the right thing was inconvenient, and he had found, with a consistency that had over the decades become genuinely dispiriting, that most people did not. He had written that he had not been testing Eleanor. He had been unconscious. He had had no capacity to design a scenario or observe a response. He had simply been a frightened man in a hospital bed, and she had been a nurse on an overnight shift who had chosen to stay. He had written that this was why it mattered more than anything he had deliberately arranged. Because it was not arranged. Because it was simply who she was when no one was watching and there was nothing to be gained. He had written, in the final paragraph of his statement, "I am leaving this trust not as payment, which would diminish both the gift and the giver, but as recognition. I am saying, in the only language available to me, that I saw what she did and I understood what it cost her, and I want the record to show that it mattered. That it changed the remainder of my life. That the person who did it was someone the world is better for having in it, and that I was grateful, specifically and enormously, every day for 25 years that she was the person in the room." Eleanor folded the statement and put it in the folder. She did not hear from Douglas Whitfield again in any direct sense. Patricia informed her in January that the challenge had been withdrawn, without explanation or apology, which Patricia said was entirely standard and should be received as the complete victory that it was. Eleanor received it as the complete victory it was. What she had not anticipated was the shape of the aftermath. The media coverage of the challenge had been small. The coverage of the withdrawal was smaller still. But somewhere in the space between them, Something had shifted in the way stories sometimes shift when the elements are right and someone with reach decides a thing is worth telling. A journalist at a regional newspaper wrote a piece not about the legal challenge but about the Presence Project. And the piece was specific and well-reported and led not with Eleanor's name or Arthur's money but with Raymond, the man who had built a house with his own hands in 1971, the man who had held Gerald's hand and told him about the vegetable garden and died peacefully at 4 in the morning with someone beside him who knew about the vegetable garden. The piece ran on a Sunday. By Wednesday, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By Friday, Eleanor's phone had rung more times than it had rung in the previous 6 months combined, which was saying something given how busy those months had been. She handled it the way she handled most things. Steadily, without performance, with the directness of someone who has nothing to manage because there is nothing to hide. She talked about the Presence Project. She talked about what it did and why. She talked about 40 years of overnight shifts and what she had learned in them about what human beings needed from each other in the moments that mattered most. She did not talk about Arthur Whitfield by name. She did not talk about the trust. She talked about a man who had been afraid and alone, and about staying. Caroline watched the coverage from Columbus and called Eleanor on the Friday evening when the 3rd national piece ran. "You are handling this perfectly," she said. "I am answering the questions I am being asked," Eleanor said. "Which is not as simple as it sounds," Caroline said. "I know people who have spent years learning to do what you are doing naturally." Eleanor thought about this. "I think when you have nothing you are trying to hide and nothing you are trying to claim, it simplifies things considerably." Caroline was quiet for a moment. "He was right about you," she said. "He was right about you too," Eleanor said. "He told me you were the finest person he knew. I have been finding that to be accurate." The fellowship program launched in the spring of the following year, which was a year and a half after Caroline had first knocked on Eleanor's door with gold flowers and a letter from a law firm in Columbus. 6 fellows, selected from a pool of 47 applicants, brought to Sycamore Falls for an intensive training period with Eleanor before being placed in partner facilities across 3 states. They were extraordinary people, the 6 of them, each carrying something specific that had brought them to this particular work, and Eleanor trained them the way she had trained the first cohort, firmly and with high expectations, and with the understanding that what they were doing was the most important kind of work there was. On the last evening of the training, she told them about Arthur. This time she used his name because enough time had passed and because they needed to understand the full account, the complete circle of it, so that they understood what they were part of and what it meant. She told them about the night in room 408. She told them about the photograph of a laughing young woman. She told them about the 4 hours and 17 minutes and the apple pie she had been meaning to take home for 3 Tuesdays in a row. She told them about the letter on the kitchen table in September and Caroline with the gold flowers. She told them about the Sunday morning drives to a farmhouse 40 minutes east of Millbrook, a man alone in an empty kitchen making certain. She told them that this, all of it, the fellowship, the training, the partner facilities, the volunteers sitting with people like Raymond while someone who loved them was unreachable on an international flight, all of it had begun with a Tuesday night in February when she had moved a chair to the side of a hospital bed and decided to stay. One act, she said. Not heroic. Not unusual, not to her. Simply what the moment required from the person in the room. And this is what it became. She looked at the 6 of them, sitting in a circle in her sitting room with Edmund on the window seat and the spring evening coming through the open windows, carrying the smell of the garden. This is the radius of it. You are the radius of it. Every person you sit with, every hand you hold, every voice you are in the dark when someone is afraid, that is the radius continuing to expand outward. You will not always see it. Most of the time you will not see it. But it is there. Sue Jean, who was one of the 6 fellows, raised her hand. She had been part of the original cohort and had applied for the fellowship the day applications opened. My mother died alone, she said. That is why I am here. She paused. I used to think about what I could have done differently, whether I could have gotten there sooner, whether I could have changed the ending. She looked at Eleanor. What you just told us made me understand something I did not understand before, which is that I cannot change my mother's ending, but I can change someone else's. That is the same radius. That is me being in it. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Yes, she said. That is exactly right. They were quiet for a while, the 6 of them and Eleanor, in the sitting room with the spring evening coming through the windows. It was the particular quiet of people who have found where they belong and are taking a moment to recognize it. Edmund relocated from the window seat to the center of the rug, which was as close as he came to joining a group. Eleanor looked around the room at the six fellows and thought about Arthur Whitfield driving on Sunday mornings to stand in an empty kitchen and be certain. She understood now fully what he had been certain of. Not just that the gift was right, that what it would become was right. He had understood, with the precision that was his particular gift, that Eleanor would not keep the money, that she would not use it to make her own life larger in the ways that money usually made lives larger, that she would use it to do the thing she had always done, but with a reach that a nurse on an overnight shift in a regional hospital in Ohio could never have achieved alone. He had funded the radius. She thought that was probably the most generous thing she had ever encountered, and she had spent 40 years in rooms where generosity appeared in its most essential forms. The Presence Project marked its second anniversary in February, and Eleanor marked it quietly, privately, the way she marked most things that mattered to her. She drove to Maplewood Regional Hospital on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week it had always been, and she walked through the lobby and up to the cardiac floor and stood for a moment in the hallway outside room 408. The room was occupied. She could see through the small window in the door that an elderly woman was asleep in the bed, her chest rising and falling with the steady regularity of someone past the acute phase and moving toward whatever came next. A monitor beeped its quiet rhythm. Eleanor looked at the chair in the corner of the room, the same chair she had moved to the bedside 25 years ago, or one like it. These things got replaced. She stood in the hallway and let the memory of that night be present without trying to make it mean anything beyond what it was. A Tuesday in February. A frightened man. A chair moved 6 feet to the left. A decision to stay. Then she walked back down the hallway and out through the lobby and into the February morning. Caroline was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against her dark blue car. She had driven from Columbus that morning without telling Eleanor in advance, which Eleanor had come to understand was Caroline's way of showing up for things that mattered, without announcement, without making it a production, simply appearing. Eleanor walked across the parking lot. Caroline stood up straight and looked at her with those dark eyes that Eleanor had been looking into for a year and a half now, and that still, sometimes, made her aware of Arthur's presence in the room in the way that certain people carry their parents in the specific architecture of their faces. "Did you need to see it?" Caroline asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Was it what you needed it to be?" Eleanor thought about this honestly, the way she thought about everything. "It was a room," she said finally, "with a chair in the corner and a monitor beeping and someone sleeping through February." Caroline nodded. "Which is exactly what it was then," Eleanor said. "Exactly that and nothing more and nothing less." She looked at Caroline. The meaning was never in the room. It was in the choosing. They stood in the parking lot in the February morning for a moment, the two of them, connected by a man who had driven on Sunday mornings to be certain, and who had built his final years into something he was proud of, and who had wanted the record to show that one person in one room on one Tuesday night had made a difference of the kind that does not appear in ledgers or news coverage or any of the places where the world keeps track of what it values. "I want to show you something," Caroline said. She reached into the bag she was carrying and took out a small frame. Inside the frame was a handwritten note on a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone soft. Eleanor looked at the handwriting, which she recognized as Arthur's from the 3 pages of his letter she still kept in the folder in her study. The note said, "Find the woman who stayed. Tell her it mattered. The rest will follow." "That is the note he left me," Caroline said. "With the envelope for you. That is what he wrote when he asked me to find you." Eleanor looked at the note for a long moment. She thought about Raymond and the vegetable garden. She thought about Sujin and the radius. She thought about 6 fellows carrying what she knew into rooms she would never see, in hospitals she had never worked in the dark hours of Tuesday nights in February and every other night of the year. She thought about the garden in Sycamore Falls that was hers now in the way that only things you have grown from overgrowth into intention are truly yours. She thought about Edmund on the window seat and Joan's toast and Patricia's unfazed competence and Gerald asking, "What do you need?" She thought about a man alone in a parking garage carrying a photograph of a laughing daughter and making his way to her. She thought about a chair moved 6 feet to the left. A decision made without calculation. A Tuesday. I would like to keep that, she said. If you are willing. Caroline held it out. He would have wanted you to have it. Eleanor took the frame and held it carefully, the way she held things that mattered. The rest will follow. She read aloud, quietly, to herself and to Caroline and to the February morning. She looked up. Did, she said. They stood in the parking lot for another moment, the two of them, and then Eleanor put the frame into her bag and they walked to their separate cars and drove back. Separately and in the same direction, toward Sycamore Falls, where the garden was waiting to be started on in March, where Edmund was making his considered arrangements on the window seat, where the Tuesday evening sessions continued and the fellows sent their reports and the Presence Project did what it had always done, which was send people into rooms and ask them to stay. Eleanor drove the 40 minutes back in the February morning with Arthur's note in her bag and the particular quality of settled that Joan had identified in August, the settled of someone who has what they actually need, and she thought that this was what showing up became eventually if you did it long enough and with enough consistency and without expectation of return. It became a life. Full one. The fullest kind. The kind where 40 years of quiet Tuesdays added up to something you could not have designed if you had tried, because the best things never arrive the way you plan them. They arrive in the middle of blizzards and cardiac wards and ordinary February nights when you move a chair 6 feet to the left and decide, for no particular reason other than that it is what the moment requires and you are the person in the room, to stay. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.